I began to believe that the world was silently pushing me out of my habitable position. Eventually, it would push me into a hostile environment that humans are no longer intended to survive. Once again, I felt I was in danger. Hello, I am GD, your host and writer for Out of Context. This is my third channel update and is intended to cover who I am. It's a long story, so let's continue. I didn't know what the solution was, so I made an equally dangerous decision. I was going to abandon my home and a majority of my possessions. I was going to travel across the country, forcing myself to make contact with humanity in the most vulnerable way I could imagine. I was cracking and in psychological danger, but I didn't recognize this. I just assumed that I was being treated cruelly because I, as an individual being, had somehow deserved humanity's wrath. So, I was going to make the first move. I was going to make myself vulnerable and learn collective humanity's true intentions towards me. If I was going to die as a result, so be it. I wasn't going to waste my life playing games I had no comprehension or awareness to play. I was going to force humanity's true intentions out into the open. I would understand myself holistically and fully comprehend my strengths and weaknesses. And hopefully, I'd be able to return to my friends, cured of my rotting disposition. I was naive. Traveling across the country, on foot, could be dangerous. I was convinced that wild animals would be the greatest threat to my existence. Carrying a firearm might be a solution, but if I was traveling along highways, as I suspected I would, it might be illegal. I wasn't interested in investigating the legality of such countermeasures, so I decided my travels would take place during the winter, when I suspected less animals would be active. This wouldn't eliminate the possibility of animal contact, but perhaps it would limit my chances of contact to fateful encounter rates. I started making preparations. Firstly, I needed to see how far I could walk in a day's time. I began walking to a nearby village and back, timing the distance between the two destinations, and then repeating until I felt exhausted. Next, I traveled along the highway, on foot, during the winter, to see what highway conditions would be like. My trial run for this endeavor was to travel from my home to my father's dwelling. By vehicle, it would take approximately 30 minutes. On foot, it took approximately 8 hours. I hadn't determined this to be unreasonable, so I continued forward with my plans. My father, mother, and landlord's lover didn't think my plans were safe. They were correct, but I felt like I needed to match my physical safety with my psychological safety, something that I was convinced had never happened. For the most part, I ignored their pleas for my safekeeping. I emptied my room, giving all of my possessions, with exception to the ones I wanted on my journey, to my father. He said that I could come have them back, should I request it. But I psychologically refused this offer. This journey would be my death and perhaps my transformation, and nothing I threw away would return to me. At least, that's what I believed. I left my residence, drove the vehicle loaned from my father back to his house, and began my journey. My bag was heavy and not comfortable to carry. I had made a mistake in my preparation, and remedied it quickly by abandoning more of my possessions along the roadside. My father had noticed my poorly selected carry wares and purchased me a proper backpack. While I was walking, my back already aching, my father intercepted and delivered to me this proper equipment. The journey was slow, boring, and uncomfortable. The dreadful adventure I expected it to be. After approximately 8 hours, I reached my destination. I stayed the night, and the next day, in town, I went to the local library and began looking for available work. I decided that I would travel and work to pay for expenses while, searching for my place in the world, searching for the me that wanted to be a part of this world. But I didn't find any work, so I stayed the night and prepared to move on. I should also mention that while I was in town, I picked up a second backpack to balance the weight of my belongings. I would wear one on my front and the other on my back. Early the next morning, I left. This time, I decided I was going to travel the back roads. This would extend my travel time, but I hadn't suspected this would be a problem. It was cold, but my coat was thick and retained a lot of heat. However, problems started to arise. The water I kept in my bag was freezing, making it impossible to drink. I could keep it inside my coat so it would remain warm and drinkable, but the inside of my coat was filling with condensation. Whether this was because of poor ventilation or because of the force I was exerting while carrying the weight of my belongings, it's hard to say. The problem was that I couldn't rest properly. While walking, I seemed to generate enough heat to combat the cold, but while I was stationary, the condensation that had now soaked my chest and torso was turning cold and sapping my energy. I could only stop and rest for a few minutes at a time. Any longer, and I would have to start moving again in order to generate enough heat to combat the cold. My legs and hips were burning, eventually becoming numb. I managed to balance myself and used my forward momentum to maintain a reasonable forward walking pace. I would estimate my speed was between 4 or 5 kilometers per hour. Eventually, I reached the highway, but between all of the discomforts I was feeling at the time, I was exhausted. I could only walk a few hundred meters at a time before needing to rest briefly. My destination was approximately 12 hours away by foot, and taking the back roads had extended this travel time by an additional few hours, and my exhausted pace was now doubling the remaining travel time. It's possible that I would have been outside, in the cold, and exhausted until midnight before reaching my destination. And what if all lodging was closed by the time I had arrived? There was a definite possibility of death from exposure to the cold. Perhaps the most logical solution would be to ask my father for help. I had a smartphone sealed in a sandwich bag to keep it safe from excessive exposure to moisture, and turned off to save battery power. Calling someone would not have been an issue for me, but I refused myself that right. I was trying to escape from my reality and reassert myself. Relying on others would defeat the purpose of that, I thought to myself. Yes, my father was providing me support, and yes, some of that support I did accept, but refusing that support, I thought to myself, would just create more problems. My father wanted to feel like he could help me when I was in danger or suffering. I didn't quite understand this, so I let him help to avoid controversy, not because I wanted the help. But this situation was different. He was unaware of my exhaustion, the current situation I found myself in, and I convinced myself that even if I was in danger, he didn't need to know. This was my problem, and I could deal with it on my own. As I traveled along the highway, my pace reduced. Eventually, I stopped, unable to force myself to continue. I consciously turned to face the road and fell backwards into the snowbank. I'm not exactly sure what I was planning to do at that time. Wait, rest, freeze, or die. Any one of those things would have had their merits given my current state of mind. It was a couple of minutes later that a vehicle stopped along the side of the road, and the occupants asked if I needed assistance reaching my destination. I considered refusing their offer, but given my state of being at that time, refusing help, even from strangers, seemed incomprehensible. Like if I were to offer help to someone in the same position, and they refused, and something happened to them. Well, it just seemed like refusing help would be an awkward thing for me to do. They drove me into town, approximately 10 minutes from where they picked me up. I was dropped off at a recommended lodge, and I made reservations to stay there for the next 7 days. Thank you for listening in. Have a wonderful day.